Good morning. So what this is about is me asking myself, how do I make sure that my research is useful? How do we convert the evidence that we've collected into something that's actionable and useful to conservation? And now I'm going to think about it with my dolphin project and how we go about preventing them being caught in the shark nets. So I would like to start by bringing you up to speed and share with you what we know about humpback dolphins and their interactions with shark nets. Then I'll go on to identify the gaps and tell you what I think is impeding conservation action, and then think about new avenues and how we might use something like a human-wildlife conflict roadmap to guide us on the pathway. Humpback dolphins are endangered all around the world, and in South Africa as well, for a variety of reasons. But here, one of the major threats to them is mortality in the shark nets in KwaZulu-Natal. Most people think of shark nets as fences and barriers that prevent sharks from approaching the bathing area. But actually, they are gill nets that are set to catch and kill sharks. They are there to decrease the population sizes of sharks and in that way decrease the risk to bathers. So essentially, they are a fishery that targets sharks, and there are unintentional deaths as well, which we call bycatch. And these are turtles, dolphins, harmless sharks, and rays. When we began, we looked at the distribution of humpback dolphin bycatch in KwaZulu-Natal. There have been 46 beaches with shark nets between 1980 and 2009, and I didn't label them all along the bottom of the graph because it's confusing, but there are a few landmarks there for you. And what we found was that many more humpback dolphins die at Richards Bay every year than anywhere else along the coastline. And it's customary to check if it's got anything to do with the number of nets that are at that beach. So we looked at the number of dolphins relative to the number of nets, and the trend is actually very similar. You can see it's obvious. Most of it's happening at Richards Bay. So 60% of the humpback dolphin bycatch that occurs at KZN is happening at Richards Bay. We've looked at their behaviour. The Richards Bay shark nets we've discovered are set in a core feeding area for humpback dolphins. And so the nets are here off the end of the pier. There's a zoomed in picture. And that is essentially right here and right in this core feeding area. We've done other work as well. We've used a technique called photo identification, where we look at the dorsal fins of the dolphins, and many of them have nicks and notches, which we use as fingerprints. They aren't all distinctive, but enough of them are that we can follow individuals over time. And in 8 years, we catalogued 109 distinctive individuals. And one of the things we did with this was to look at the residency and the site fidelity of the dolphins. So we quantified how much time they spent in the area and how often they returned to that area. And we used this to figure out their dominant movement patterns at Richards Bay. We quantified the probability of resighting using a lagged identification rate, which is the probability that an individual that is in the study area at a particular time will be re-identified again later. And what's important about this was that we then went on to check against various models to see what type of movement patterns we had. And the model options are, is it a closed population where there's no movement in and out of the area? Is there temporary emigration out of the study area and then back in again? Is there permanent exit from Richards Bay? Or is there some combination of these models? And the best fit model was this one of permanent exit from the population. In other words, there's been a net loss of dolphins from Richards Bay over the 8-year study period. But the models can't tell us if that's due to immigration or to mortality. So in asking that question, we went back to our... Oh, my pictures are gone. Oh well. So the Sharks Board allowed us to photograph some of the dolphins that they'd caught, and then we went back and interrogated our catalogue, and we found that some of the dolphins that were in our catalogue had ended up in the nets. And that leads to the conclusion that at least some of that permanent exit is due to shark mortality in the nets. We also looked at the residency and site fidelity of those individuals that had been caught, and we found that most of them were transients, which are infrequent visitors, but the residents were overrepresented in that bycatch sample. And what does this mean for us? Well, one of the things that we think is that Richards Bay is actually an ecological trap, which means that on one hand it's a very attractive area to these humpback dolphins, but on the other hand it has a high mortality risk. And we think that the small population at Richards Bay is being impacted by the nets, but also the wider population is probably also being impacted. And can't say exactly what that wider population is, but it seems that the effect is extending beyond just at that localized spot. So what does this mean for conservation? Resources could be maximized if we focused our efforts just in one small area. So then onto the gaps. Not all of this is new evidence. Some of it are presented here in 2013. And my hat off to Sharks Board. They have been trying to do things to mitigate this bycatch. But in that time, we've not managed yet to implement any real changes at Richards Bay. And it looks a lot like a classic research implementation gap. And when I think about why, everything keeps coming back to the fact that any changes to the shark nets has the potential to affect risk to bathers. So I've come to the conclusion that I need to change my perspective. I need to look at this more holistically and consider the larger issue, which is protecting bathers from shark attack. And if we address this conflict between bathers, if we think about it as a conflict between bathers and sharks, it offers up this framework, the Human Wildlife Conflict Framework, which Redpath et al. Provided a roadmap to help understand and manage conservation conflicts. Before I talk more about the Human Wildlife Conservation Conflict Roadmap, I found that there's another way I'd like to change my perspective and around this research implementation gap. And it's around the terminology of gap and the language, because gap is very negative and it suggests a deficit. And synonyms are negative like chasm, rift, and breach. And Anne Toomey, Andrew Knight, and Joss Barlow, they've got more positive ideas, and they think if we use terminology like space, they have more positive connotations of multiple dimensions, of arenas and capacity and place. And one more thing about what they were writing was they are suggesting that we reconceptualize these research implementation gaps as productive spaces in which scientists and publics can interact around shared interests. So here's the Human Wildlife Conflict Roadmap, and it looks very complicated, but essentially there's two parts: mapping the conflict and then managing the conflict. And I'll begin by focusing on the mapping the conflict, which involves identifying all of the stakeholders, gathering an understanding of how they are feeling around the issues. Collecting evidence, identifying the impacts, looking at the wider context, and then checking that the stakeholders are prepared to talk to others. The scientific process, the social science process is marked in red and is at most of the steps, whereas the ecological process is marked in green and is just at steps 3 and 4. And usually the stakeholders are only included right at the end of this part of the process. And I think it might be quite useful to start including the stakeholders earlier, because we might get oh, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. If we include them earlier, then they will participate differently and they might have value to add to the whole process. So if I look at this relative to my particular situation, identifying stakeholders wasn't really very hard. The main stakeholder is the municipality, particularly the section that deals and pays for the shark nets, and also the tourism section, since they are indirectly involved. Obviously, the Sharks Board is a stakeholder. Wildlife organisations like Endangered Wildlife Trust and Ezemvelo KZN Wildlife, and then the community groups, the people who use the water or are involved somehow in tourism. The next step would be mapping the attitudes and positions, and some of you may have filled in my survey this morning. Thank you very much. I plan to survey people's knowledge and perception and attitudes and beliefs, which are all subtly different, around sharks and shark nets and protection from shark nets, protection from shark attacks. And I'll use a questionnaire, which is basically a scientist and stakeholder interaction, but I'd also like to use something that's a little less conventional, which is a knowledge cafe or world cafe. This is a type of meeting where many conversations are had by delegates in small groups which rotate frequently. And I'm very curious to know who's heard of a World Cafe before? If you have. Has anybody participated in one? Okay. And has anybody run one? So it expands the scientist, stakeholder, and stakeholder interaction quite a lot. I imagine it will, and I'm hoping it will. And one of the reasons this is very good is because there's evidence that groups of diverse problem solvers can outperform groups of high-ability problem solvers. The step following that would be to gather evidence, and this is usually a purely scientific endeavour, and I think it's an opportunity for co-generation of knowledge, and I think it should be the stakeholders who identify the questions that are important and prioritise them, and appoint investigators. And talking to some of the stakeholders ahead of time, they've got some sensible questions that I think scientists would ask, and perhaps some more that we might not think of. But they've come up with things like, well, what is the risk of shark attack relative to other dangers, like drowning? What alternatives to the shark nets are there? Where are which sharks species are caught, and when are they caught? And are there other things that we can do in the meantime to mitigate the dolphin bycatch until we can effect bigger changes? Now I'm going to skip ahead to managing the conflict, because I'm really looking forward to this part where we get to sit down and explore different ways of thinking and potential solutions. I've got some ideas about using results chains as fuzzy models to select indicators and monitor how the different alternatives might work. But it's really exciting, the thought to actually test some of the alternatives, to put things into the water, see what works, see what doesn't work, tweak them until we end up with something that can work at Richards Bay. That means that people could swim safely, as well as dolphins and sharks. So I've offered you some evidence of a net loss of humpback dolphins at Richards Bay. And I realized that in spite of the research, conservation action is difficult to implement, and mostly that's because of the risk to bathers. Viewing this issue as a shark-bather conflict creates an opportunity. Perhaps we could use the human-wildlife conflict roadmap and navigate the space between research and implementation. So thank you very much to our partners and sponsors, and to you. And this is actually, please help, because I'm a biologist and I don't have any social science training. And I'd really like to connect with people who have got more experience on this and listen to what you have learned and can teach me. Thank you.